What's going on to all the NBA freaks out there? I'm Hoops Freak Fensty, and this is the Hoops Freak Fensty series here that we have going on, talking about all things 90s into the 2000s with the NBA. For those that don't know me, Justin Fensty, Fensterman is my name, at Fensty Sports, F-E-N-S-T-Y Sports on X and Instagram. I IG and post a lot of 90s and 2000s related material. Why? Because it was freaking awesome, and that's why we're talking about one of the golden ages of the NBA, the 1990s, where we saw, due to the expansion of us being able to see these teams, national stage, television rights, this made the sport grow, among other things. And talking about what else made the sport grow, rivalries. And how about this rivalry? The New York Knicks, as you see, I'm rocking my Patrick Ewing jersey right here. As you can see, it's a little tight there. Might have to go into some training like old Coach Pat Riley used to train. In fact, I've watched a lot of interviews with those mid-90s Knicks when Pat Riley was running the show there. Not exactly Showtime, very different. A rough and rugged defensive New York Knicks team in the mid-90s, but John Starks would even say it that with Pat Riley, that first practice, he had some trash cans on different parts of the court because people were vomiting. They were ralphing from that hard training. I'm going to need to put myself through some of that. But the Knicks-Pacers rivalry in the 90s was one of the things that brought more interest to the NBA. And that's because of the similarities between the two teams. The first time these two teams met in the postseason, it was 1993. Now, leading up to that point, the Indiana Pacers, and by the way, as you know, part of this with Hoops Freaks Fensty is that I'm also going to be talking about some of my favorite NBA documentaries, books, so that you can watch, so you can enjoy it even more. And from the ESPN 30 for 30 series, Winning Time, one of my favorites because of the Knicks-Pacers rivalry. So leading up to the early 90s, the Pacers kind of had two identities. They drafted very well. Donnie Walsh was a master when it came to that. And he drafted Chuck Person, Rookie of the Year in the 80s, and then Reggie Miller. Now, for those that remember 1987, Indiana University won the national championship. Steve Alford was all the rage, and now this was going to be great, the prodigal son going home, and instead Donnie Walsh chooses Reggie Miller, stunning the locals in Indiana. But it was the best move to make because by the time we reached the 90s, the Indiana Pacers, you had Chuck Person, who is one of your go-to scorers, can put up points just like Reggie Miller can very, very quickly. Detlef Schrempf, who could do just about anything, whether he was in the starting lineup or coming off the bench, which back in those days, he was a decent amount before he went to the Seattle Supersonics. But back then, it wasn't what the Pacers became. But slowly and surely, by the time we reached 1993, 1994, the Indiana Pacers were able to run with the Bulls. The Bulls, by the way, that by 94 didn't have Michael Jordan anymore. But this rivalry between the Knicks and the Pacers starts in 1993. In the first round, the Knicks, the beasts of the East, laser focused on getting past the Chicago Bulls, who had eliminated them year after year so far in the 1990s. And in the first round, they're taking on the Indiana Pacers, who up to that point, you had Indiana versus Boston in 1991, where Larry Bird got hurt in the critical Game 5. For those that remember, first round series until the early 2000s used to be best of 5 rather than best of 7. But in that critical Game 5, Larry Bird made that Willis Reed come back into the game, and boom, just like that, Boston was able to overcome Indiana. The following year, once again, Boston was able to be successful. But then in 1993, the Knicks and the Pacers did battle. And in that series, where the Knicks were in control because the Pacers were still establishing their front court by then. But in that first round, which the Knicks won in 4 games, the series is most infamously remembered for a headbutt from John Starks to Reggie Miller. Thinking about it right now, watching that happen I was probably 6 years old at that time, and I was shocked at what just happened. Reggie Miller talking to John Starks, which, if you watch Winning Time, that stems from when Reggie Miller was trying to give him a little dap. John Starks, beginning of the series, and Starks, tough guy, not having anything of it. Pat Riley, New York Knicks teams were told, do not talk with the other team, especially when you're about to face them and you're on the court with them. No exchanging of pleasantries. None of that. That is what the New York Knicks were all about back in the mid-90s. They said it, multiple members of those New York Knicks teams. They're going to win the game or the fight. Well, Reggie Miller talking to John Starks, and John Starks had a temper. He had a temper. All of a sudden, he could go from everything's great to he throws the ball at the scoreboard behind the basket. That is how John Starks can change on a dime. So in that game 3, Knicks up 2-0 in that series, John Starks, after Reggie Miller continues to trash talk him, headbutts Reggie Miller and barely even touches him. It seems like something out of the WWF. Barely touches him, but Reggie Miller, as he did so many times in his career, especially after that, did an amazing acting job making like with this shocked look that, whoa, I just got headbutt by this guy. And the referee throws John Starks out of the game. John Starks thrown out. Pat Riley trying to get him off the court. Patrick Ewing getting in John Starks' face. What are you doing? It's a playoff game. Come on. I'm sure any of you would have reacted that way. If, let's say, you were playing high school sports and one of your biggest, most impactful players loses their cool and just gets thrown out of the big pivotal game, you'd be furious. Patrick Ewing was furious. And John Starks' mom actually spoke to Patrick Ewing after she saw Patrick get in John Starks' face and push him, get him off the court. Charles Oakley pushing him, getting him off the court so that nothing even worse happens at that point. But John Starks' mom said to Patrick Ewing, don't ever put your hands on my son. And Patrick Ewing responds to John Starks' mom saying that if he does the headbutt again, that he's going to take him out. And I think that is just hilarious right there, because you got to keep your cool in these situations, in these games. The adrenaline is at an all-time high, but John Starks, being the shooter that he was, you have to stay in the game. John Starks got thrown out of the game. Indiana wins game 3. It goes to game 4, still in Indiana. The Knicks end up winning the series, and they move on in the NBA playoffs. The Pacers lose in the first round, but you started to kind of see what they were about, because this Indiana Pacers team, by the time 1993 hit, they were in a little bit of transition. You had Reggie Miller, who was needing to have the ball in his hands more. They saw what they had in him. They had gotten rid of Chuck Person prior to that. Detlef Schrempf was still on the team, and then they got rid of him after that. And they traded Detlef Schrempf, which is a very fascinating trade. A guy who you need him to bring up the ball, set up other teammates, he could do it. You need him to rebound, he could do it. You need him to score, he could do it. You need him to shoot well from the line, he could do it. They trade him for a very, very phenomenal defensive presence. The Pacers had scores. They needed to size up a little bit more, help out Rick Smits in the post, and they did, because they got Derek McKee. And Derek McKee was huge for this Pacers team. Huge. And that made the Indiana Pacers tough, because by that point now, entering the 93-94 season, Michael Jordan's gone. He leaves, he retires for the first time to go play baseball. Now all of a sudden the Eastern Conference, and in fact, if you think about it, the entire NBA, which has been on padlock from the Chicago Bulls the previous 3 years, who won the title, now all of a sudden somebody else can step up. No more Michael Jordan. Bulls still had Scottie Pippen. They still had pretty much the rest of their core, but not having Michael Jordan knocked them down a little bit. And so you start to look around the league and around the Eastern Conference, and who you're thinking, well, the Atlanta Hawks are hanging in there. The Orlando Magic are now on the rise. They have Shaq. Then in 93, they draft Penny Hardaway. Or they draft Chris Webber and then trade for Penny Hardaway. And I could do an entire thing on that, on what changed the Magic. But you had them in the mix right there. Charlotte was starting to mature a little bit more. So all of a sudden, you saw a bunch of teams that had their chance. Charlotte had Bogues, Mourning, and Johnson. Just think back to NBA Jam, because a lot of those teams had those impactful players. It wasn't super teams or anything like that. It was, I don't want to say more of a balance, but you can recognize at least one stud on just about every single NBA team, except for the Los Angeles Clippers. But they did have a piece that was very important to this Knicks-Pacers rivalry. Now, the New York Knicks, how were they built at this point? The Knicks, having the tough guys that they had, besides having Patrick Ewing, their dominant force in the middle, they had a bunch of shooters by this point, and including guys like Hubert Davis, guys like John Starks. They had Charles Smith, who could score, but also a nice size piece with Charles Oakley in the post. Anthony Mason, one of their primary enforcers on the team. This Knicks team was rough and tough. And this Pacers team entering the 93-94 season was rough and tough, because now you're looking at a team that has Reggie Miller, Rick Smith, but then you've got guys like Dale Davis, Derek McKee. You've got Antonio Davis there. So many bigs. They became such a tough team to compete against because they had their offense. They had guys like Byron Scott. They had Reggie Miller. So they just had to stop the bleeding on the other side. Rick Smith's a nice offensive force, but they had to stop the scoring. And the Knicks, with the way they were built at the time, you knew that if these two teams clashed again, it was going to be a big-time battle. And then it happened again. In 1994, except this time, it wasn't in the first round. It was a best-of-7 Eastern Conference Finals. I mentioned the Bulls without Michael Jordan. The New York Knicks needed 7 games to barely survive the Scottie Pippen-led Chicago Bulls at the time to go to the conference finals. The Pacers, at this point, able to get to the conference finals. I don't want to say pretty easily, but it wasn't really that tough, that path. But that wasn't because the matchups were easy. That's because of one of them being the young Orlando Magic in the process, who were making the playoffs for, I believe, the first time in their franchise history. And then the Pacers were able to get rid of them. But they're a good team. They're a better team. They're a tougher team. They're going to make you work. They're going to knock you down. I know as the NBA evolves, you start to look forward, but sometimes, and especially back then where, let's face it, the refs' whistles were very laxed, still in the 1990s. But sometimes looking backwards to try to figure out what you need worked in the NBA. The Detroit Pistons, the bad boys, what was the big thing they had besides some of their flair like Isaiah Thomas? They had bangers. They had guys that are going to knock you down. Guys that don't care about scoring, don't care about MVPs or anything like that. They know their job. Their job is to intimidate, and their job is physicality. And that's what made this Indiana Pacers team in the mid-90s so dangerous. That's what made this New York Knicks team so dangerous. Both teams had good shooters, but they were more ground and pound. They're going to ground you. No easy layups. That's what it's about. Now, you go to the 1994 Eastern Conference Finals. Pretty even series. Because in New York, the Knicks did their job. Indiana, the Pacers did their job. And in Game 5 of the 1994 Eastern Conference Finals, that's when the next layer of this whole thing happened. And by the way, getting Larry Brown certainly helped Indiana back then too, while the Knicks were still riding with Pat Riley. Game 5, the Knicks are looking pretty good. Reggie Miller's having a cold scoring game. And they say, hey, fans, They're part of the game. And we've seen it happen. We've seen fans become a big part of these NBA games over time. But it happened back then. And Reggie Miller and Spike Lee had a bit of a relationship. Spike Lee, the number one Knicks fan, who's had season tickets since the 80s, who's sitting courtside, huge New York Knicks fan, and even back then, especially playoff games, he was going on the road all the time. He was the biggest Knicks fan. Still is the biggest Knicks fan. But he was, even back then. However, he almost became the biggest enemy, a bigger enemy than Reggie Miller to Knicks fans. And that's because in Game 5, as it was entering the fourth quarter and the Knicks had a nice double-digit lead, keeping pace. Anytime the Pacers would try to go on a run, the Knicks would respond. The Knicks were in control. And all of a sudden, here comes the Indiana Pacers, and they start the fourth quarter, and Reggie Miller's still throwing up bricks. But now, coming from the stands, Spike Lee is yelling at Reggie Miller every single time he's touching the ball, calling him ice cold, making fun of him, laughing at him very loudly, being very physical with the movements. And what did that end up doing to Reggie Miller? Rather than making him feel even more sorry for himself, Reggie Miller got fired up, and Reggie Miller went on an amazing scoring rampage that game. 39 points, 25 of them, 25 in the fourth quarter. And Spike Lee wasn't talking much anymore. And now Reggie Miller looking at Spike. He's looking at Spike. He's pointing at Spike. He's talking trash to Spike Lee. Remember, everyone, there's an NBA game going on. There's a game that's live. That's how great Reggie Miller is. And that's how great these athletes are. They can focus on the game and impact the game. And Reggie Miller can have an entire back and forth with Spike Lee coming from the stands. Now, Reggie Miller, as he's starting to hit shot after shot after shot, and the Knicks are not adjusting, more of an inside presence of a team. Knicks aren't adjusting. They're not putting a guy on him. They're setting the Pacers basic pick and rolls. And Reggie Miller has said this in multiple interviews. He went in just give me the ball mode. And when you have your shooter doing that, you got to start stepping up to the arc. The Knicks weren't doing that. Pacers were setting one screen. Reggie Miller takes 3 steps to his right, open 3, hitting threes from well beyond the 3-point arc. And the Knicks are doing nothing about it. And he's trash talking Spike Lee. And it gets to a point where Reggie Miller puts one hand on his neck, and then he actually put another hand on his crotch. That's right, his privates. He did that. And that's where it kind of got a little personal between them, because Spike Lee's wife was sitting right next to him. And when Reggie Miller did that, it was kind of between them and, Spike, a major disrespect. Meanwhile, Spike is still trash talking Reggie Miller. Reggie Miller goes on this rampage. The Pacers win the game. They steal the game in Madison Square Garden. Back then, especially, hard place to win. They go up 3-2 in this series. And the next day, the Pacers, Sports Center, the papers, Sports Center, everything, blaming Spike Lee. Blaming him. Completely blaming Spike Lee. That's where the focus shifted. That's how this rivalry became real multidimensional. It went beyond the basketball court. And Reggie Miller was having a blast with it because he was getting in everyone's heads. Game 6 comes. Now they're back in Indiana. And everyone's ready to celebrate because the Pacers are doing a darn good job in Game 6. And then Spike Lee's there. He's sitting there, nervous as hell. He knows that he can't go back to New York. If the Knicks lose this game and the series, this is their shot. Remember, no Michael Jordan. They took out the Bulls, a team that haunted them in the early 90s. Haunted them. They took out the Bulls with or without Michael Jordan. Who cares? They made it past them. This was their opportunity to go to the NBA Finals. John Starks goes on a little scoring run of his own at the end of Game 6, and the Knicks were able to hang on against Indiana to go to game 7 at that point. Now game 7 between these two teams. Back and forth we go, nice and close. And then the Knicks went down, then they caught up. But then at the tail end of the game, John Starks goes up with the ball. The ball's coming off the rim, and Patrick Ewing times it right, dunks it back down. Took that ball and dunked it back down. Coming off the rim, slammed that ball back down. Just like that. And the Knicks ended up winning the series and went on to the NBA Finals. And Reggie Miller bummed after the game, caught crying after the game, so the Knicks fans were able to get it back to him. What changed going into 1995, the 94-95 season? The Pacers made a very interesting trade. They end up trading some of their more utility players, and one of them also, I believe, Pooh Richardson in this deal, who was starting for them. They trade him in a package where they get Mark Jackson. Now, Mark Jackson, for those that remember, St. John's guy, drafted by the Knicks, was very good with the Knicks. And in fact, the Knicks actually did that a lot because they had multiple guards, multiple guys that could bring up the ball in the late 80s and even the early 90s too. And the Knicks, surprisingly, because they wanted more size, they traded Mark Jackson to the Clippers in that Charles Smith deal when they got Charles Smith. Mark Jackson, they get him, the Pacers. Now, the Pacers get Mark Jackson, veteran guard who can bring up the ball, immediately transitioning into the team's starting point guard. Still in his prime at the time when he first came to Indiana. Knows the Knicks. Knows these guys. Played with a lot of these guys. The Knicks core didn't change that much between 1992 and 1994. Not that much. So Mark Jackson knew how to get to the Knicks. And better passing, better setting up Reggie Miller. And also with the Knicks, that roster, which had a lot of them been together for a while, was starting to age a little bit too. It was starting to age. Patrick Ewing, who by the end of his career, he was wearing knee ice packs on his knees that were about this wide. At this point, all of a sudden, the legs are starting to go a little bit. But the Knicks and the Pacers in 1995, they met again in that one. And in 1995, we go to game 1. And in game 1, we've seen this scenario before. We go back to game 5 of 94 in the conference finals. Now we're in the second round in 1995. Remember, also Michael Jordan back, by the way. So now it's kind of shaky ground. Is the king back? And now the conference theirs once again, or is there maybe a little window that another team for at least another year, because Michael Jordan came back in March and everything wasn't fully ingratiated, still getting his knees under him. Was there an opportunity? There was. The Knicks and the Pacers meet again, this time in the second round. Knicks having home court advantage once again. Game 1 of that series, which is, if you think about NBA games to be remembered, you turn on NBA TV, you want a game that's on constantly. Game 1 of the 1995 second round between the Knicks and the Pacers. Knicks are up by multiple possessions at the end of the game. About 13 seconds to go. Pacers inbound the ball immediately to Reggie Miller off a screen. The same crap that he's doing every year. The same crap. Pat Riley, how you don't figure this out? And I know you're in the game. You're thinking of a million ways that they could score. Try to get one more stop and then have a little bit more control of your series destiny right there going up 1-0. But he does the same thing. Quick pass in, Reggie Miller hits a 3 right away. Takes about 2 seconds off the clock, and that's it. What ended up happening was the Knicks ended up inbounding the ball after that, and Anthony Mason, who had no business even inbounding the ball, essentially threw it because people were tripping over themselves, different Knicks, throws it to Reggie Miller. Reggie Miller gets it, the ball, and quickly takes his 2 steps behind the three-point arc, which to have that and to do that, to have that mentality to know where you are on the court after getting a big-time steal and then be able to go back beyond the three-point arc and hit another 3 just like that in about 5-6 seconds, the Pacers pretty much erase an 8-point deficit. They score 6 points very quickly. 6 points. The Knicks not knowing really what to do, can't believe what just happened here. The Pacers end up giving the Knicks a break in that game. They foul. And you're like thinking, why are the Pacers didn't have to foul? Pacers end up fouling, I mean, at this point. And it's a tie game. It's a tie game. Pacers just hit 2 threes. And the Pacers end up fouling. John Starks goes to the free throw line, misses 2 free throws, misses them. And then the Knicks foul the Pacers right after that. And Reggie Miller goes and hits 2 free throws. 8 points. 8 freaking points in 13 seconds. By then, maybe 9, because the Knicks had one more possession and they screwed it up, completely screwed it up. They tripped over themselves and they didn't even get a shot up. And that was the end of the game. And everybody is there just being like, what the hell just happened? Reggie Miller, that's what he did. What happened in Game 5 in 1994 happened once again in an even more crucial way in 1995, Game 1. Crazy. And that is what the series is truly remembered for. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Knicks fans? The series goes on. Kind of once again starting to get in the Pacers' favor this time. Pacers had more youth. And they've had the perfect veteran in Mark Jackson, too, to help them navigate the series. They actually went up 3-1 in the series. Game 5, Patrick Ewing saves the Knicks at the end. Although in questionable travel, he hits a shot with just a couple of seconds to go to put the Knicks up. And then they end up winning the game. And the Pacers had one shot at it, but Reggie Miller couldn't hit it. And then the Knicks were able to take that momentum and win Game 6 back in Indiana. Now they're back at the Garden again, Madison Square Garden, Game 7. Same thing as the year before, except in the second round, not in the conference finals. And the Pacers end up winning that game and the series, finally defeating the Knicks. Patrick Ewing down by 2, got the pass in, goes right down the middle to a layup to just lay the ball right in, bounces off back iron, and that's that. The Pacers win the series. They go on to lose in the conference finals to the Orlando Magic, but they beat the Knicks, and that was their first time beating the Knicks. Then they met again, this time a few years later. Again, Michael Jordan back in the thick of it. The Pacers and the Knicks met in 1998, and the Pacers beat them very, very easily in that series in 1998. That's it. Just 5 games, Knicks were out. Reggie Miller could not be stopped in that series. And this was at this point, while the Pacers were rocking a very similar core, the Knicks were really starting to age, and they changed their mix up a little bit with their roster. By then, Charles Oakley aging a little bit, Patrick Ewing certainly aging, John Starks aging. They bring in Allen Houston. They bring in a more veteran Larry Johnson. But that series, the Pacers completely crushed them, destroyed them. It barely was a series. You go to 1999. 1999, they meet again, this time back in the conference finals. This was the lockout-shortened season. And this is how you know it's a rivalry. We're at the point where 93, 94, 95, they meet. They don't meet in 96 or 97. 98, they meet. 99, they meet again. Conference finals, close games in games 1 and 2. Game 1, Mark Jackson had a chance to hit a 3, put Pacers up, did not hit rim. Patrick Ewing was able to grab the rebound. The Knicks escaped in Game 1. This is, by the way, when the Knicks, who are now the 8th seed entering the NBA playoffs, they're here. And they beat the Miami Heat. They beat the Atlanta Hawks. Now they're facing Indiana, who is the better team than them and was for that lockout-shortened season. Game 1, the Knicks escape. Game 2, the Pacers end up escaping because Charlie Ward, who you remember, Mr. Florida State, Mr. Heisman football player right there, throws a freaking football-like pass to Patrick Ewing, sailing over the Pacers defenders. Ewing gets it, turns around, takes a shot, misses it, and while he's coming down with the shot, he essentially damages his Achilles. And that's the end of Patrick Ewing for the NBA playoffs. And the Knicks by that point also had Marcus Camby helping them out too. So Marcus Camby was able to step right in. Chris Dudley able to step right in. But that game 2, that shot, no more Patrick Ewing. Game 3, the Larry Johnson 4-point play. And that's where at the end of the game, Larry Johnson gets the ball and Antonio Davis fouls him. He hits a 3, hits a free throw to put the Knicks up, and then Mark Jackson could not hit the shot to give the Pacers the win. And the Knicks kind of had a Indiana Pacers-like performance, but Larry Johnson hit a few wild shots in that game. And I just remember sitting there and I jumped up, leapt out of the chair when Larry Johnson hit that 3. Never saw Madison Square Garden go more crazy than that, crazier than that. So that's when Larry Johnson hit the 3, hit the free throw. The Knicks win the game, and then the Knicks end up finishing off Indiana as the 8th seed in Game 6 to go to the NBA Finals, where they got destroyed against the Spurs. Big-time rivalry between these two teams. Every year it was a good series, except for really 98. But all the other years were really good series. 2000, they meet again in the conference finals, except this time the Pacers, being laser focused on getting over that hump, finally do. They beat the Knicks in 6 games. And that whole series, the Pacers, which now the Knicks, Allen Houston, Latrell Sprewell, really started to take command of this offense. Patrick Ewing, this was actually his final year with the New York Knicks. No more Charles Oakley, no more John Starks on this team. So the Knicks trying to get a little bit younger and trying to make more of an impact that way without breaking everything up. But by that point in 2000, the Pacers still had that size advantage, and then they ended up getting guys for a couple of years like Chris Mullin to help out a little bit from the Run TMC squad in Golden State. But in 2000, the Pacers just looked like the better team. They finish off the Knicks in 6 games, and then they lose in the NBA Finals to the Los Angeles Lakers. But during that run, physicality, you saw ejections during that run. You saw Reggie Miller get in the face of the Knicks. The Knicks get their revenge on Reggie Miller. You saw the trash talking, the headbutting, and the fighting. And you saw the great shooting. And if you had to think of a rivalry, and one of the rivalries from back in the 90s that really exemplifies what the 1990s were all about with the NBA, Pacers-Knicks, one of those rivalries. Go watch the documentaries. Watch this again. Have some fun with it. Look up highlights. This is what's so great, is that we get to become aware once again of what was once awesome. And then after that, we can keep the smiles on our face because that awareness factor remains as we look up those clips and enjoy one of the golden ages of the NBA, Knicks-Pacers rivalry that spanned most of the 90s, and that's why 90s NBA is awesome, and that's why Hoops Freak Fensty is here. See you freaks later.